Hi there, I'm John from CNCKing.com, and today we'll make a fur mold using our CNC router. So the evolution of actually using fur to make molds is pretty a long one. When I first started making kids banks at sandboxranch.com, I thought oak was the best material. No, you do everything out of that. And then, with COVID and all the other things, the pricing for oak just shot up through the stratosphere. So right away I was like, okay, well I gotta find another hardwood that would sort of do the job. And for that process there, we ended up with poplar, and it works really, really well. I always saw 2x4s in the background, but I never thought I could actually make anything of substance with it. I always thought of 2x4s as something that's structural. You build furniture, you build things with it, but not actually for an industrial process. And it kind of surprised me because this came out totally amazing. Now there's a little bit of this kind of stuff here. Again, it's a softwood, that's fine. Customers picking this up and actually cleaning everything out for it. They're the professionals in molds, I'm not. So basically they want me to just make the rough mold for them, and then they clean it up with Bondo, resin, and a bunch of other stuff to make some really nice products out of it. Whenever I make these molds, the process is basically the same. I go to a big box store, I buy a bunch, in this case here, 2x4s, although I've done projects since then with 2x6s and 2x8s and larger ones. And you basically cut them down to the size of the mold that you want to have. Now the reason for using this material is, one, it's very cost effective, it's very easy to find, and because I'm doing a lot of routering with it, you'll notice that I'm shaving off the top and the bottom of the 2x4. Sometimes my measurements are a little bit off and I need to go get an extra 2 or 3 or 4 2x4s. It's very easy, it's just a couple of minutes away, so I just go there and get them and bring them back to the shop and continue on the mold making process, versus having custom brought in lumber that might take a couple of days or a week or two to arrive to the shop and do the same sort of work. Now what I'm doing here is finding the top and the bottom of the 2x4s, and the reason for that is because when I do the lamination, I want an exact perfect 100% fit. And what the surfacing router bit also does is it creates a nice little rough surface. So basically I remove the tougher outer surface of the 2x4 and I replace it with a softer one that has a lot of texture to it. And that's wonderful because when you do the glue up, it just sticks so wonderfully. It's just so perfect and everything is square and parallel. So it makes my job of lamination so much easier compared to just about any other way of doing it. Now there is a couple of tricks to doing this kind of stuff, and one is 2x4s are generally warped pretty badly. So the nice thing about having to cut them into smaller pieces is the warping is reduced. And with my router cutting through this stuff, it cuts through it pretty quick. I do have a planer, I could do this with a planer, but I just find it easier to do it with the router. Again, it's an overkill machine to be doing this kind of stuff. There's a lot of easier ways of doing it, but for me, this process works totally fine. And what I'm doing is marking it with pencil so I know which parts are elevated, which ones aren't, because once all the pencil marks are taken off, then I know I have everything flat and parallel for the next process to come up to make this mold. So when it comes to laminating fur, in this case here from 2x4s, there's no real difference between that and oak, poplar, hardwood, softwood, or even MDF for that matter. There's no real difference. It's just basic glue, you're sticking it together, you're making sure everything's flat and parallel, and everything works actually pretty well. I spent over a year trying to figure out how to do it properly, and I'm happy I finally have, because now we're doing more and more of this type of work, and it's nice to have the diversity and the experience of sticking different hardwoods and softwoods together to produce a final product. And it's a lot of fun to actually do. It takes a long time to do properly, but it's a lot of fun to do. Now you'll notice that whenever I do the glue ups, there's tons of glue everywhere. That's just from experience, because if you try to skimp out on the glue, which is the cheapest part of the whole process, what you end up sometimes is with voids. And what that would cause is, let's say there's a little section here that didn't have glue and it didn't bond properly. So when I'm going over with the router bit, what's going to happen is it might rip that whole part out, or it might fill up with sort of other issues. It might move on me, that kind of stuff. Or it might actually crack the whole mold, depending on how deep it is. So I prefer to put way too much glue and have to deal with that afterwards, not a big deal, than not put enough and then have other problems that could happen during production. Every time I go about doing this process, I think of a better way of doing it. And I haven't found the best way to do this process. It works fine with smaller pieces like this here, but now we're getting to larger and larger molds, heavier molds. And it just takes so long that I start to get concerned that the glue will dry at one end before I'm done the other end. So what I'm starting to do is separate them into chunks, glue that, and then glue the chunks together. But again, there's got to be a better way of gluing 2x4s together and 2x6s and so forth. And I haven't found it yet. I'm still playing around with the different processes. But as you can see, I prefer to err on the side of too much glue than not enough. The last thing I want to do is carve this thing out and then find out I have a void with no glue. And then that little piece either goes flying to my head, or the mold breaks apart and I got to redo the whole thing all over again, because as soon as something moves, you lose the precision. So for this process here, you can tell I'm using the roughing bit because a lot of stuff is flying everywhere. And what the roughing bit is, removes most of the material. And I never have any problems with that end, but I do have issues with this end, which you see here. And this is basically the cleaning path. Now the cleaning path works great, but the issue with it is that it's such a small bit and it's so long that it's very, very prone to breaking. Now having the roughing bit go over it removes almost all the material, but there's always some little voids that you just don't notice or see. And then what happens is the carving bit goes through it. That's why I'm slowing it down, because I think there's some voids. So the carving bit hits it and it goes from skimming off 1/10 of material to maybe 1/4 inch of material. And that breaks the bit almost immediately. And in this process here, I actually broke a bit. So it's not a big deal. I have an absolute machine, which means the XYZ on it, as long as nothing moves, everything's identical, even if I have a power failure or whatever. And it's such a wonderful thing to have on a machine like this, especially when you're doing these kind of molds that take hours and hours and hours and hours to make. So what are limitations when it comes to molds? There aren't really any. I could do aluminum with this machine just as easily as all the hardwoods and softwoods you've seen through the years. The real limitation is basically the size of the table. And what I mean by that is our table here is 5 feet by 10 feet. So we could technically make a mold that's bigger than that. The only issue with a bigger mold than that, we have to figure out how to stick it together, keep the dimensional accuracy. And what I mean by that is, let's say you want a mold that's 5 foot by 20 feet. Well, then we got to sort of figure out some sort of jigsaw or way to have it adhere properly so that it's proper Z, X, and Y. So if you're looking for custom molds, contact me at CNCKing.com. We'll make it for you and ship it right to your door.